Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namasami. I'm going to continue reading Venerable Father like I was at the end of the retreat, at the beginning of the retreat, and now at the end of the retreat, wanting to, as we near the end, create a circle, start wrapping it up with a bit later on in the book, so I'm skipping forward from where I ended before in the first weeks of the retreat. This is chapter 4. And if you'll remember from the story, Paul Breiter, his disciple, is a Westerner who ordained with Ajahn Chah and very early days. And this is getting on to when he's about 4 vasas. So he disrobed after 6, I believe. I think he was 6 when he disrobed. In his 6th vasa, yeah. So I was getting up there, and he's just... It's a very classic book, so it's just more of what we've read already, just some of his vignettes and just painting a picture of life at Wat Pah Pong in those days. May 1986 is when he wrote this. Yeah, that's right. It was 1974, and I was still down in the frog pond with Ajahn, who is now Mr. Sinuan. That was the year that Ajahn Chah instituted his annual birthday gathering, where the Sangha would come together to tumwat with him. Tumwat means like puja, to tumwat with him, rather than coming in small groups after the vasa had begun, and where there would be a Sangha meeting. I had come to Wat Pah Pong in May, as I vaguely recalled Longpor having said something about training the Farang monks at Visakha Puja time. Though when I arrived, he was gone and nobody knew anything about it. Still, it was an excuse for a vacation. I went to the much-feared dentist at the Ubon Hospital and decided to wait around for the birthday party, after which I could return to Nong Hai with Ajahn Sinuan. At the Sangha meeting, Longpor asked if anyone had anything to discuss. As could be expected, nobody said anything, until Sinuan spoke up. It was a disgrace, he said, the way monks, especially the senior ajahns, were always falling asleep during desanas and all-night sittings. This was one of his pet peeves. I had often heard him expound on this, and heard him boast that nobody ever saw him falling asleep, though nobody ever saw him trying to sit up all night either. Ajahn Chah acknowledged this, but didn't have much to say about it. In past years, we brash Farang had brought up the subject of poor posture in meditation, and why didn't people receive training in how to sit? Longpor's answer then had been, "What's so difficult about sitting properly? Just do this," as he sat beautifully erect without strain or slackness. Then he said, "Have you ever seen any monks falling asleep behind their bowls at mealtime? No, they're like this," and he imitated someone sitting ramrod upright, bright-eyed and alert. "It has to have food," he said, good-naturedly, as many Thai monks seethed, I found out later, at this latest Farang indiscretion. Then, in the Sangha meeting, Longpor brought up a few items. Prostrations. "It gets worse all the time," he said. "Sinuan stopped prostrating altogether," he said in terse Lao, and he did an imitation, bending his head slightly and fluttering his hands as the city ladies usually do. Back at Nong Hai a few days later, I was at Sinuan's kuti one afternoon, and he said, "I really told them, didn't I?" i.e., about the ajahns falling asleep. I replied, "Longpor really told you, didn't he?" i.e., about prostrating. He saw red, changing to his "I'm right and nobody can tell me anything" tone. He said that prostrations are only a convention. It doesn't matter what you do externally. It's what's in your mind that's important, etc. I said, "If that's the case, then I can sit like this," and leaning back on one elbow, I stuck both feet out at him. Fortunately, there was nobody else there to see this. Probably any other Thai Ajahn would have been stunned right out of his skirt, but Sinuan, whom another Jewish monk and I had decided must have been our mother-in-law in a past life, didn't bat an eyelash. Though when our relationship was strained to breaking later on, he brought this up and said that anyone else would have kicked me out of their wat. So life went on. When it became obvious that I was in for another vasa of work and Vinaya readings, I threatened to leave a couple of times, even packing my gear and cleaning out my kuti once. But he was patient and kind, even finally allowing me to practice in my kuti during some of these group activities. As I mentioned, there was a large number of temporary ordinations, especially novices. They were pretty wild kids, and Sinuan did little to control and often much to encourage them, such as playing games with the dogs, feeding them while we were eating, making sunglasses for them out of cardboard and colored plastic wrapping paper. One day I confronted him about one boy. "How can you just let him run wild in your monastery?" I asked. He countered by offering me the chance to train the boy, so we tried. It turned out that Narong had been something of a juvenile delinquent in the village, but I liked him and felt that he needed some attention. He would boil water for me. I would give him a little instruction and chores to do. It seemed to be working, and I became inspired with utopian visions of new ways of education. Then we had a falling out. He wouldn't listen to me anymore. I took him to see Sinuan. I aired my complaints. Sinuan asked Narong, who was by now in tears, if he wished to continue with me. The answer was no. Sinuan said, "You see, it's not so easy." It was a good lesson, and one that another Ajahn wouldn't have been inventive enough to give. But by the time the end of the vasa approached, I'd had enough. I felt inclined to seek out some serious training and group practice, perhaps with Ajahn Chah, Longpor's second senior-most disciple. 2 days after vasa, we went to the katina at Wat Pah Pong. There wasn't going to be a katina at Nong Hai, so I took my leave of Ajahn Sinuan. I had long since gotten out of Longpor's doghouse and was basking in the afterglow of having recited the Patimokkha during my parents' visit in the Vasa, when I surprised Longpor and the whole Sangha by finally doing something well. So Longpor received me as just another monk, and I could feel that internally and externally things were on a new footing. It seemed like a turning point. One afternoon, alone with him at his kuti, Longpor asked me if I was going to disrobe. It was one of those rare conversations where he spoke to me in a serious and direct way, and therefore that sticks out in my memory. I asked if he meant, was I going to be a monk for the rest of my life? "That's what I meant," he said. I told him that I couldn't make my mind agree on it, but added, "I've got faith to persevere." He acknowledged this by saying, "It's better than before, isn't it?" "Will you disrobe?" is a common question, and one that he certainly took seriously. But once when I told him that in moments of inspiration I thought, I won't just ordain for all of this life, but for 10 lives in the future, he just remarked, "Oh, 10 lives of misery, huh?" The time after Vasa is usually a more relaxed time in the Wat, but I didn't particularly feel like I could relax. I could see a little beyond merely surviving and look more clearly at the immediacy of birth and death and the terrors of endless samsara. There was something spurring me. While it kept me from being too slack, I think it made it impossible to relax and to appreciate the subtler aspects of Dhamma, Vinaya, and Ajahn Chah himself. But it seems like that's the way the training has to go, experiencing extremes until one finds the middle. Longpor compared it to a child learning to write. The letters come out crooked and sloppy, and the only thing to do is keep practicing. In early December, we went to a Papa ceremony at Wat Ba Kha. At Wat Ba Kha, a new temple in Ampur Det Udom. About 100 people filled the small sala. After Longpor went back to Wat Pah Pong, I stayed on with a few others. A few lay people would come in the morning. 5 or 6 would spend the night on Wan Prat. It made me realize how wherever Ajahn Chah went, people would turn out in such large numbers. End of the year was visa time, so I went back to Wat Pah Pong. Work had begun clearing the land for the Uposatha hall, the boat. Most Wats in Thailand are eager to build a boat, whether they have any use for it or not, and they all come out looking the same. Luang Por had resisted the urging of his lay followers for a long time, but now that he'd decided to do it, he seemed to be quite taken up with it. Some Farang monks even started asking, "Do you think Luang Por has a boat, Kilesa?" The design seemed to be known only to him, and the final result was quite magnificent, unlike anything I've seen anywhere else in Thailand, except some of the banks in Bangkok, perhaps. He had become an upajjhaya, or preceptor, by this time, and having a boat would make Wat Pah Pong more complete in that bhikkhu ordinations could be done there. One of the Westerners who showed up at this time was Gary, a layman from California. I think Luang Por took a special interest in him, which in practical terms meant that he made life difficult for him, thereby leaving a few good stories for posterity. Gary was a clinical psychologist in his late 30s. He'd studied Zen a little and had been in Japan recently. Didn't seem particularly sure about what he was going to do next. After a short stay, he had to leave as his visa was about to expire. We were outside the sala after evening chanting when he told me that he was leaving the next day. I was just about to head back to my kuti when I had a sudden intuition and asked, "Why don't you go and take leave of Ajahn Chah?" So I went to Luang Por's kuti with him. I told Luang Por that Gary was leaving and had to come to pay respects. Luang Por immediately zeroed in on him. He asked what his occupation was. Psychologist is mind scientist in Thai. The mind scientist dies because of the mind, Ajahn Chah said. Pause. The boxer dies because of boxing. The snake doctor dies because of the snake. The mind scientist dies because of the mind. Understand? I translated this, and then he went on. You can see this mind at work. Is it you? Is it yours? I don't know if it's me or mine, but it's certainly out of control, was Gary's answer. That's it, said Luang Por. The mind is like a monkey, he continued, always jumping around, never content. It goes upstairs and it gets bored, so then it runs downstairs, but it gets bored there too. It has bad food and it gets tired of that. Then you give it good food, but it tires of that. So it goes to a movie, but in Buddhist practice, he explained, we stop nurturing the monkey. Rather, we nurture mental stability. We stop feeding the monkey, let it wear itself out and die. This is called a dead monkey. The dead monkey rots away, then it's called a monkey's bones. Luang Por was right on target. It was one of those occasions when you felt that the whole kuti was filled with light, and I could see that Gary appreciated what was being said to him. We took our leave, and when I said goodnight to him, he said, I think I'll come back here after I get my visa renewed. Of course, I'd heard that before, but he actually did come back and ended up ordaining and staying for almost 3 years. One of the well-known Gary stories concerns Luang Por's advice to the broken-hearted. Gary had a girlfriend back home and thought that he might want to go back and marry her someday. He had entered monastic life without a sense of long-term commitment. Then the Dear John letter came. She had married someone else. I wasn't there at the time, but others said Gary was pretty upset. One day someone mentioned it to Luang Por. With his merciless compassion, he advised Gary to write to the woman and ask her to send her a vial with some of her excrement in it. Then, whenever he thought of her with longing, he should open the vial and smell it. I think that's the... didn't he do that, like pantomime it?
Oh, he did pantomime.
So that's a great story. The visa business taken care of, I wanted to leave Wat Pah Pong for a more secluded place, but wasn't sure where to go. In those days, Luang Por said that he wouldn't allow more than one farang to live in any of the branches. Ajahn Jun's Wat Ban Khao Luang was where I wanted to go, but there was a Farang monk there already. One night I went to Luang Por's kuti. He was talking with a few monks. Wat Ba Kha needed a monk. He looked at me and asked if I wanted to go. I had liked the place when I was there, but hadn't thought about returning there to stay. I said I'd like to go, but was thinking about going somewhere to make a new umbrella for my mosquito net. He pulled one out from under his seat and said, "You can have this one." "When do I go?" I asked. "Tomorrow after the meal." So that was that. I went in a car with an old Laotian monk whom Luang Por called Pa Sieng Noi, Father Little Sound, i.e. he had a high-pitched voice. He was small, a ball of energy, and pretty funny, though I'm not sure he intended to be. We were met at the Wat by another old monk, Pa Boon, a Dhammayut monk from Nakhon Phanom, seemingly the exact opposite of Pa Sieng Noi. Tall and thin, quiet, dignified. All his actions seemed to be so meticulous and mindful, not a drop of energy wasted. I began to think after a while, if there's an Arhat in Thailand, it's Pa Boon. Pa Sieng Noi was visible and audible, his output of energy obvious. I sat between them. They complemented each other perfectly, it seemed. We got along well. Only a few lay people came. The food was adequate. We didn't do much work or group practice. Somehow I felt more content as a bhikkhu than I had ever felt. One morning, even feeling joyous! ! It was a combination of factors, but the company of the two old gents was something special. Ajahn Chah had said that as a young monk, he liked to live with the old Lung Ta, the elderly monks. Lung Ta it means like monk ordained later in life. He liked to live with the old Lung Ta, asking them what it was like to be old and nearer to death. Now I found myself enjoying the peacefulness of two men who had nowhere else to go, and marveling at their energy. They went on the longer Pindabat while I took the shorter route. When the leaves started to fall, they would go out early in the afternoon and sweep for hours. Hot season was trying to begin, and I began to drag my tail. The old guys were running rings around me. One evening before chanting, Pa Sieng Noi and I were drinking tea with sugar. Pa Boon abstained as he usually did. "If I drink it, it just makes me hot," he said. I said it made me hot too, but at least it gave me some energy. "An old person and a youngster are really different," he said. "An old man has aches and pains and felt tired yesterday. He feels the same today, and he knows he'll feel the same tomorrow. He sees home. He knows the end of the road is near, so things don't matter. But to a young man, they still matter." This was very revealing to me. It helped me to understand how so many of the old monks I'd lived with were able to practice so hard. Paul Boon was the senior monk, but didn't feel inclined to give desanas to the handful of people who came on Wan Prat. But Pa Sieng Noi would occasionally talk without waiting for a request. Once he gave a brief talk on meditation. "The mind is fast. The defilements are just a little slower. You want to know what defilement is? I'll explain it for you. A man once went to Ajahn to learn how to meditate. The Ajahn said, 'Sit still and repeat Buddho to yourself.' After a while, the Ajahn asked, 'Okay, while you were sitting and trying to concentrate on Buddho, what did your mind think about?' The man answered, 'I kept on thinking about a flashlight bulb.' That's it. That's defilement. A flashlight bulb." In late February 1975, we all returned to Wat Pah Pong for Magha Puja and the funeral of Ajahn Chah's mother. Luang Por had allowed a huge number of temporary novice ordinations for the occasion. Some of those who ordained were long-time lay supporters, and a few of them stayed in robes for the long term. There were 2 successive nights of desanas. The second night, I was doing a walking meditation outside the sala when Luang Por came out the back door. It was late, the crowd had thinned out, and he was alone, so I went up to him to escort him back to his kuti. As he walked away from the sala, he said, "Anicca, dukkha, anatta. I can't listen to anymore." It was encouraging to know that the chief himself didn't take these ordeals too seriously. As soon as the ceremonies were done with, I asked permission to go to Bun Khao Luang. I arrived there at the beginning of a very hot and dry hot season, and it was just in time for another funeral. A young monk, Bun Rot, had gotten malaria, which went to his brain and killed him. The body was being kept in the sala. One of Ajahn Chah's favorite slogans had always been, "It's better to die than disrobe. Better to disrobe than slack off the practice." So now he was saying, "You see, Bun Rot made it. He died in the yellow robes." Something to aspire to, that was. After I'd been there a few days, Ajahn Tieng showed up one evening. He was the senior-most disciple of Ajahn Chah, abbot of the first branch monastery of Wat Pah Pong, and Ajahn Chah's crony. I was happy to see him, since he came with an entourage of lay people who had brought a big bucket of iced coffee. I paid my respects, downed a few mugs, and took my seat for evening chanting. After we chanted, Ajahn Tieng told the nuns to do some chanting, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta with translation and a few other favorites. Then he took the microphone that had been set up, leaned back on his fat cushion, and started talking, an inspired funeral desana. Listening to desanas wasn't my favorite pastime, but when they were talking about death, I had always felt I had to put my likes and dislikes aside. It was something I had to listen to. After 2 hours, he stopped, so I went back to my kuti for some yoga, but I soon heard his voice over the loudspeaker again. I guess he had just stopped to catch his breath. After another 2 hours, he handed the microphone to Ajahn Chah, who spoke for 3 hours. Then it was dawn, so we went on Pindabat, just another working day in the life of a bhikkhu. At midday, just as I was getting comfortable, someone came to drag me out of my kuti so I could stand out in the hot sun and chant while they set fire to the body. Then afternoon chores, a bath, a brief rest, and a meeting in the boat. Ajahn Tieng was still there. "Warapanyo, stay up all night?" he asked me. "Yes, I did," I answered. "No," he said, "I mean tonight." Well, I hadn't really thought about it, I meekly said in desperation. He was off and running. "If you don't sleep tonight, you can sleep tomorrow night. If you don't sleep tomorrow night, you can sleep the night after." He sent for the nuns, and they did the chanting routine. He began another desana. Around 2 a.m., I gave up and went to get some sleep. Although Ajahn Chah wasn't doing much teaching or training, there was good energy in the daily routine of the Wat. The bell rang at 3 a.m., as elsewhere, but everyone was sitting in the sala by 3:10. I would have to move as fast as I could, with no time for thinking or for the famous Bun Khao Luang mosquitoes to get me. I would half run to the sala in order to not be the last one there, or at least not to get there too long after all the others. Everything, including eating, was done briskly. Without much talk, everyone did their share to keep the practice going. Occasionally, Ajahn Chah would give us a desana, usually in the scolding Isan manner. Once he said, "You guys should have lived with Luang Pa. I'm easygoing, but he was really ferocious." That was very interesting. Most monks seemed to be terrified of Ajahn Chah, whereas most of the Farang experienced Luang Por as the kindly grandfather. One evening on Wan Prat, as we began to sit after the chanting, Ajahn Chah said, "Get in a good meditation posture and make up your minds to sit there till dawn without getting up." Then as we sat, he began to scold us about almost everything: eating, sleeping, daily routine. Naturally, I took it personally, except for when he talked about smoking. After 2 hours, he rang the bell so we could get up. "You fraud," I thought, though I was glad that we didn't have to continue sitting without moving. But I had taken his desana to heart, or so I thought, and felt guilty and upset for the rest of the all-nighter, perhaps a classic example of grabbing the snake by the tail. Since he had talked so much about greedy eating, I determined that I wouldn't stuff myself as I liked to do after the all-night practice. I hardly ate anything, was the first one finished, no mean feat in that Wat. and as soon as I saw Ajahn Chah finish eating, I jumped off my seat to take his bowl for cleaning. "What's the matter?" he said. "You ate so little." That made me feel a little foolish. It made me reconsider what the previous night had been all about. Later on, when I was with Ajahn Sumedho at Wat Bungwai and hearing the teaching in my own language and idiom, I began to get a new perspective on all this, and this one episode stood out in my memory. After I'd been there a few weeks, 2 high school friends came to visit me, and they also arriving in time for a funeral, this one for a village woman. I had known one of them since age 3. His personality and the life he'd been leading were a vivid contrast to what I'd been doing as a monk. It made things very clear for me. In a monastery, you often feel like you're just plodding along, putting in time. You may get obsessed with little problems or with your own shortcomings and sink down into the feeling that not much is happening, and perhaps it's just plain hopeless. Then you get a look at how people live on the outside, how confused they are, seeking happiness, but because of their ignorance, finding only suffering. You look back at yourself again, realize you're following a true path, see how much you've accomplished already. This was such an instance. In addition to that, I could see that my friend needed help, so I suggested he stay for a while. This really terrified him. He had had some idealistic picture in his mind of what I was doing there, and thought he could come and get some instant transmission that would open the pearly gates for him. When he saw how we actually lived, it wasn't so romantic. I suggested he stay for the 2 months of his visa, then 1 month, then 2 weeks, then 1 week, a few days. Ajahn Chah was very sympathetic and offered to make life as comfortable as possible for him, but Joe saw it as a death sentence. After 2 days, he left. I felt like I was holding my own, keeping up with the pace of things in the Wat, and it felt like something of an accomplishment in itself. Ajahn Tiang dropped in one afternoon, and when I went to pay respects, he asked if I was Sabai, living there. I thought about it and answered that I was, and he said, "That's good enough. You can settle for that." It seemed like a reasonable attitude. When times are hard, one hopes for dramatic breakthroughs, but in fact, the burdens gradually lighten, and peace and contentment build up without one's thinking about it too much or taking much notice. Ajahn Tiang also mentioned that Ajahn Sumedho and a few Farang monks had gone to live in some place near the railroad tracks, not far from Wat Pah Pong, and that they were establishing a monastery there. In the beginning of May, I got sick, a fever that wouldn't go away. I tried to hang in there, but occasionally would come late to morning practice. One morning, Ajahn Chah was there. He led the chanting, and we did the Parita chants, including the Bojango for curing illness. He would often talk between chants, and this time he said, "The novice has a stomach problem, may he get better. The monk has a fever, but he sleeps late, may he not get better." Very comforting. Some relatives of mine were planning to visit me at Wat Pah Pong later in the month, so I went there to meet them. When I first went to see Luang Pa and he asked me how I was, I mentioned that I'd been sick for a while, but he didn't seem too concerned. A few days later, I finally went into town to see a doctor, and much to my surprise, found out it was malaria. I had gone to the army hospital, where the head doctor was a longtime supporter of Luang Pa, and after the blood test, he checked the results himself, so I could be pretty sure the diagnosis was correct. He said that the guy at the microscope was an alcoholic and his hands shook, so you never knew if the readings were right. Thailand. I was surprised by this and a little worried, too. I remembered Ajahn Sumedho saying how he'd always thought of malaria as something dreadful, written in big red letters. I'd seen several monks with malaria, some of them extremely ill, and I knew of 2 who'd died of it. So when I got back to the Wat and checked in at Luang Pa's kuti, I didn't wait to be acknowledged. He was speaking to some lay people, but I just blurted out, "Luang Pa, they say I've got malaria." From a few hundred miles away, he coolly said, "They say what they say," or something like that. I began taking the medicine they had given me, but it didn't seem to do much good, and after 2 or 3 days, the conditions started getting worse. It became difficult to eat or sleep, leaving me with little to do but lie around my kuti in restless lethargy. I think that what I dreaded most about getting ill in the Wat was not the illness itself, but the long days of lying in the kuti with nothing to do, nothing to distract the attention, and no energy to do formal meditation. Now it was happening. Early one afternoon, unable to peacefully convalesce, I walked out to the eating hall where a Canadian monk was sewing robes for some Farang novices who were about to ordain as bhikkhus, and where others would gather as well. Soon someone was calling me from the front of the sala. My relatives had arrived. In a somewhat spaced-out state, I went to meet them. My uncle stuck out his hand, but instead of shaking it, I just looked at it hanging out there. It was a long time since I'd shaken hands with anyone or even seen anyone shake hands, and he caught me by surprise. Then, as a greeting, I said, "Where'd you get all that hair?" He'd been bald as long as I'd known him, and now he was sporting a toupee. Formalities completed, I decided to take them over to Wat Bung Wai to meet Ajahn Sumedho and let him do all the talking. Also, I hadn't been there yet and wanted to see it. They were fairly curious and had some good questions to ask. It was inspiring to watch Ajahn Sumedho talking with them, with his gift for explaining things to people in language they could understand, without watering down the message. This period was also when he first began talking about someday going to the West, something he'd never been interested in before. I felt a confident, positive atmosphere at Bung Wai and decided to go there for the Vasa. But in the meanwhile, I had to entertain my relatives for another 2 days and deal with the malaria. One night, lying in my kuti, unable to sleep, I got a little touch of delirium. I'd just read Journey to Ixtlan, and the forest seemed to be electric with mysterious energies and menacing forces. Then I thought, this is pretty strange. I took the medicine they prescribed me, and I'm getting worse. Malaria is serious business. That other monk at Bung Khao Luang died from it, and he was stronger than I am. Maybe I could die from it. Maybe I could die tonight. By now, I was beside myself with fear. Finally, I managed to catch myself. I realized it was my own creation, so trying to keep mindful, lying in the lion's posture, I began bringing up the thoughts and watching the chain reaction over and over until I could see it clearly and step back from it. I got to a point of equanimity where the terror of thinking about death was gone, and thought that if my time had really come, perhaps I was ready. Then the thought, well, I could die now, but my parents would be upset. And I got a look at various forces that pull one back to the world, to life, to birth in various states. That night was a lot of fun, but the next day I was back at the physical reality of dragging a corpse around. Like all things, my equanimity passed away. I went to the public malaria clinic in Ubon and got some new medicine. Then I plucked up a mixture of self-pity and courage and went to see Long Pa. I asked him to forgive me for bothering him, but I was in pretty bad shape, and I wondered if I should get some kind of sedative to enable me to sleep. He immediately put up his hand and said, "You take those things, you'll ruin your brain. When it's time to sleep, you'll sleep," he assured me. Then he said, "I saw that you were sick. Don't worry, you're not going to die. Were you afraid you'd die?" I answered that I'd thought about it. I'd never had malaria before. The symptoms were a little frightening, etc. He laughed at this and then said, "It's an opportunity to meditate anew." I'm going into detail on this episode for the reason that living in the tropics exposes one to various diseases, and like anything else, illness became part of the practice when it occurred. Most of the Western monks who stayed for a while experienced one or more serious illnesses, and I think most would consider it a valuable experience. Coming as we did from our comfortable, germ-free backgrounds, these diseases could be quite terrifying to our habitual way of thinking. Dependable medical care was not readily available in that neck of the woods, and Ajahn Chah was constantly pointing out to us how obsessed we were with our bodies. Endurance was an important part of his training. He once said to some Thai monks at his kuti, "You guys don't feel well, so you go to see the doctors, and they tell you you're malnourished. It's true. So what can you do about it?" After reassuring me that I wasn't going to die, he said, "I had malaria for 3 years." I'd heard the stories before about how in the early days of Wat Pah Pong, everybody got malaria, and there was simply no way to get treatment for it. But now it really hit home. Contemplating even another 3 days was difficult for me, but 3 years? Changing his tone and the subject, he very pleasantly asked me about my relatives and their visit. I related to him the story of my cousin, their daughter, who had been mugged and shot in New York City. As she was waiting for help, she used a meditation technique she had learned to slow down her bodily processes, and that was probably what saved her life. Lumpur showed interest in this, and as usual, he found the handle on it, picked it up, and gave me a beating with it. "You see, your cousin was nearly dead, but she could meditate. But Warapanyo has a tiny bit of fever, and he's all upset and can't practice." At least he did say that I could ask the kitchen to prepare rice gruel for me in the morning. The medicine finally started working, the fever abated, but I was pretty weak and had to take it easy for a while. I'd always had a reputation for taking it easy, I suppose, but now I couldn't even go through the motions and pretend that I was maintaining the normal routine. Over the years, I'd come to depend on that routine. It imposed some kind of order and kept my mind from getting too chaotic, but now I had to step back and find something else to do with my time. As I mentioned, the thought of this had always been a frightening unknown, but at this point I found myself able to relax mentally in a way I'd never done before. It was one of those times when I could look back and see the changes that had occurred, and also, for the first time, I felt I had an overview of the 5-year plan. I could see that it was a realistic period of time to allot for training the mind and overhauling one's views and habits. At this point, I had been in robes about 4.5 years and was about to enter my 4th vasa as a bhikkhu. Lumpur had often spoken of right view and sila, moral discipline, as the foundations of practice, and I could see how my habitual patterns of understanding and acting had changed, and that I had some real appreciation of sila, something that I and probably most Westerners didn't inherit as part of our upbringing. So there was light at the end of the tunnel. I also started gaining back some of the weight and bodily strength that I'd lost shortly after ordaining. By the end of the vasa, I was to become an object of wonderment and jokes because I'd become so fat. It felt like a heavy karmic burden that I'd been struggling with for years had been resolved. As my strength came back, I started hanging out with Lumpur more. Sometimes as we returned from Pindabat, he would call my name just as I was ducking my head to walk past him and go on ahead, so I would just say, "Kap," and fall into step behind him. One memorable morning, he walked around the wall of the Wat from the back entrance to the front gate. Among other things, he asked me what it was like living with Ajahn Chah. I said I liked him and respected him as a teacher, but after a while I got tired of all the tough talk about Toraman. That means torture in Thai. Lumpur asked, "Did Ajahn Chah Toraman you very much?" "No, he didn't," I answered, realizing it for the first time. "That's just his method of teaching," Lumpur said. Then he asked me about Ajahn Sinuan. I said that when I first went to live with him, I had a very positive impression, but as time went on, I began to agree with another monk who'd stayed with him that he was just somewhat lazy and liked to have a good time. "Just like me," said Lumpur. "I really like to fool around. I've got a lot of defilements." Needless to say, this caught me off balance. Then he stopped walking, turned to look at me, and with his inimitable timing and delivery said, "Listen, Warapanyo, I'm going to disrobe, and I want you to help me find a nice girl." The man who... Ajahn Chah. The man who was the comedian and the kindly grandfather could also be very tough. One afternoon, I was at his kuti with an English monk who expressed his weariness with the Toraman talk of the senior monks. Lungpo heard him out and then let him have it with both barrels. When we were laymen, we followed our impulses in everything. Did it bring happiness? What kind of practice can we have without patience and endurance? Sometimes I get angry and I want to beat you, but I have to restrain myself. I'd never heard him talk quite like that before. On another evening, a couple of Thai novices came to him to complain about the abbot of the branch monastery they'd been sent to. Actually, quite a bold thing for Thais to do, a sign of a changing society. Their abbot was temperamental and imperious. He got angry if the bell wasn't rung on time. They had to ask permission from him to do little things. They made it sound pretty bad, and sitting there in the dark, I thought I sensed Lungpo listening in sympathy, concerned that one of his monasteries was being mismanaged. Then he came down on them, repeating their complaints in a mocking voice. Of course, the bell should be rung on time. What's wrong with trying to make people do their duties properly? The abbot of a monastery is responsible for everything that goes on. According to the Vinaya, monks should ask permission to go on Pindabat, study the Patimokkha, etc. Lungpo wasn't buying it. He stood behind his abbots. He told the novices to go back there and not bother him with any more complaints. That's the end of that chapter, so I'll leave it there. So all of you should... So it's a few minutes for if anybody has any questions, comments.
Lungpo, it seems like that's a good example, like being in a rock tumbler, the image of a rock tumbler. I'm wondering what does it take to develop the endurance for that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that is just one is sort of seeing somebody like, having a good example, sort of seeing that, okay, there's a purpose to this walk family. So that seeing a good example is really important to allow one to commit to that. And then that sense of reflecting as well on the, because if you're just honing in on every little detail, then you get bounced around with the rocks, but you have to pull back a bit and sort of see, well, what's the purpose of this rock climbing business? And then when you've got a sense of the process, then you can commit to it. Those are a couple of things.
I could also say that you develop endurance by enduring.
Yeah.
How old is Lungpo Chah when his mother? I mean, how old was his mother when she died?
Let's see, she would have been probably in her 80s. I don't think so. I can't remember exactly, but I think she'd be in her 80s. Lungpo Chah, say at that point, would have been early 50s when she died, or early to mid 50s when she passed, probably mid 50s when she passed away, and he was, can't remember, he was something like the 4th child or something. So she could have been about 80, late 70s, 80, something like that.
And his father died first, or?
His father passed away when he was young. Yes, he was as a young monk. He was fairly young. He was maybe 25, 26 or something.
There's a photo, a really good photo of Luang Por Chah contemplating his mother's corpse
Yeah.
that we have. It's quite moving, quite a good photo. She was Mechi.
She was the head nun. Although there was a group of nuns at Wat Pah Pong that oversaw the nuns community, but she was one because she was in the first group of women who asked to train with Ajahn Chah.
So her name, what is her name? Her name? I can never say it anywhere.
Yeah, Pim.
I thought it started with a P, maybe.
Pim comes to mind. Pim. But she was also, I remember one time, it was very sweet, because one time I accompanied her shortly after his mom died, and she was in the sala, and then probably for about, I'm not sure for how long, maybe 3 months maybe, before because he did a whole big preparation for her cremation ceremony, and made a very beautiful funeral pyre, and many people came from all over to help build it. Did a lot of basically made kind of like a mountain with caves and tunnels coming in with the funeral pyre in the middle, and it was all made from like woven bamboo, and then covered over in paper, and then all of the community college people from the arts department came and kind of painted it, and it was done very nicely. Anyway, during the time when she was still, say, in Masala, and it was the parents of a monk came, and he took them with the monk and myself. We went over to the nuns section, and then he said, as we were going, he was showing them the nuns area, and he said, I used to come over here all the time to visit my mother, and now she's passed away. She's in the hall waiting for her cremation ceremony, and he turned with a bit of both a twinkle in his eye, but also he said, now I'm an orphan. But it was very sweet. That's the way he said it.
I always like how human Ajahn Chah is, and that's why I like this book so much, just joking around on Pindabat or just whatever.
Was the Gary in that story, is that the same Gary as Gary and Luke?
In where?
The Gary that was talked about that came to Wat Pah Pong, was that Gary, the same Gary and Luke? The Gary that comes
No. It's Gary McFarland, and Joseph Campbell has been in contact with him.
Oh, okay.
And to get, again, for Wat Nana Chah.
Okay.
So he's done an interview, and I haven't read it yet. They're still editing.
Oh, that would be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll take a short break.